every phase of this highly industrial process is polluting and having a negative impact on our coasts and oceans.
Driving my car down Pacific Coast Highway, I've always seen those offshore oil platforms off Huntington Beach my entire life. And although they are unsightly, and although I've seen the disastrous effects of oil spills firsthand, I've also been acutely aware that I'm actually utilizing and depending on oil in my daily life. So, my goal here in today's podcast is to better understand the costs of my relationship with oil. What are the risks involved in continued dependency, and what are some alternative energy solutions? My name is David Scales for the Surfrider podcast, brought to you by the Surfrider Foundation. Today we're going to be hearing from Surfrider's Ocean Protection Manager, Pete Stauffer, as well as Northern Chumash Tribal Council Chairwoman, Violet Sage Walker. But first, more from Surfrider CEO Chad Nelsen, who explained that oil spills are just the most visible problem, but that the entire endeavor of offshore oil drilling is detrimental.
Anywhere that there's offshore rigs, there's some industrialization on the coast. So there's a port or a harbor with a bunch of boats in it. There's refineries. They need to transport that oil from wherever it goes on shore. In some cases, which are part of the problem with spills. There's pipelines that need to come on shore, move the oil up and down the coast. So there's all this infrastructure associated with drilling and moving that oil or gas around. Um, and then when they drill down into the ocean, they're actually like lubricating the drill with toxic chemicals. So there's all these tailings piling up on the bottom of the ocean where they're actually drilling. Um, in places where they've actually stopped drilling, the hole in the ground that they are supposed to close often leaks, so they leave spilling behind. And then the process itself creates air quality problems. So, if you go to the port of Long Beach, it's notoriously has bad air quality for this and other reasons. So,
Is offshore drilling more problematic than onshore drilling?
that's a great question. I would say yes for a couple reasons. We learned this in the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf, which is they're hard to stop. So once, on land, we're better able. Anything you do in the ocean's harder than on land. So when it
Yeah.
starts spilling, it's a problem. It's hard to stop it. And it's also harder to clean up. The ocean's like, if you spill on land, you think about it like a river or water. It's going to flow downhill on top of the land and hopefully not get into a river or a creek, but it's much more containable. In the ocean, it's a 3D environment, so it can go up, down, left, right, and then we've got ocean currents and wind, and so it's moving around. So I think containing a spill in the ocean, and then ultimately we just don't understand the ocean as well. So like the
Mm.
ecosystem impacts are harder to measure. I think there's sort of like three or four different sort of impacts. The first and most obvious and visible phase is when we see oil spills, as we see marine mammals like otters and sea lions, dolphins, whales, and seabirds all get impacted. So you see pictures of like oiled birds, oiled mammals, and so there's like an immediate impact, which is just everything that gets oil on them, which inhibits it's a disaster, kills them
Yeah.
if they can't get cleaned, which is very hard to do. Um, there are also usually there's chemicals in the oil. So one of the things I think a lot of people think about is they're like, oil, it's this natural substance. Well, a lot of the oil that's being transported is they're adding benzene and other like horrifically toxic chemicals to lubricate it, to move it around. And the oil itself has toxicity. And so, and then when there's a spill, they like in Deepwater Horizon again, they use these dispersants, which are toxic to try to break the oil up.
Okay.
So that oil can impact the ocean life. They're still finding oil in the intertidal zone in Alaska from the Valdez spill from 1989. Um, and then it can have health effects for the people cleaning it up or people on land. So the there's deep sea corals. I have a friend that works at NOAA that's studying the impacts of deep sea corals from the Deepwater Horizon spill. So all kinds of negative impacts. Not to mention it, closes the beaches to recreation.
Is there a benefit to having a domestic oil supply and even increasing domestic oil supply?
I don't think a lot of people know that like the United States right now is the number one producer of oil and gas in the world. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's us, and that happened under Obama and Biden. So it's, not like it's a super partisan issue. And so we are energy dominant. We are a net exporter of oil, and oil is a global commodity. So just because they drill it offshore the United States, there's no requirement to sell it back to us. So not really an energy security issue. I guess you could argue that we could try to take it, but that would require some sort of federal action because the oil companies are not obligated to do that. Um, and it's because it's a global commodity, it's not changing price at the pump. You hear about this, right? The price per barrel of oil is going down, so OPEC's reducing supply to raise the price. So it's a manipulated market, so if we produced a lot more, that wouldn't necessarily reduce the price at the pump. So a lot of these are the sort of false rationales used to justify drilling. None of them are actually true.
So, is there a benefit economically for domestic oil drilling?
No. There is a benefit for the oil companies, not for the rest of us.
Okay, not for the American economy is bottom line.
Well, is Exxon an American business or is it a global business?
I would guess global.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, these are the largest corporations on the planet, but they're operating at a global level. So, sort of, you know, does it add to our overall GDP and all of that? I guess somewhat. Here's the thing that's interesting is the coastal tourism and recreation industry in America is 14 times larger than the oil and gas industry. So we have a much bigger and more robust ocean and coastal tourism industry than oil industry. And that industry is also distributed throughout society. So mom and pop surf shops and restaurants and hotels are benefiting 14 times versus these giant international conglomerates. So you know, I would argue that the total net benefit of the oil and gas industry is negative if you think about, what happens when they spill, which they always do.
Pete Stauffer is Surfrider's most informed person with regard to oil spills.
Yeah, I'm Pete Stauffer. I'm the Ocean Protection Manager for Surfrider Foundation. Spills happen all the time. The smaller ones tend to be underreported by the media, and industry will often underestimate them. The larger spills can be catastrophic and cause, impacts that will persist for decades. So I'd have to go back and look at some of our stats, but according to NOAA, which is a federal agency, we've had, I believe, over 40 major oil spills of over 10,000 gallons in the past 30, 40 years. So, again, those are major oil spills, and the smaller spills you're probably not going to read about or hear about.
That sounds like one a year, basically, among the majors. Have they decreased in frequency? I mean, have methodology for extracting oil gotten safer over the years?
Well, I mean, that's what industry would claim, but I guess there's a couple things I would point out. When we had the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, not only was that a major spill, but if you recall, for days, they couldn't even figure out how to stop the flow of oil.
Right.
And that's because a lot of offshore drilling has moved into deeper and deeper water, where the risks are elevated, where the pressure and the potential for accidents is elevated. So, in fact, industry is actually moving because, at least in some cases, they've exhausted the shallower, deposits that are in shallower water. So that is actually compelling them to go in deeper water. And then the other thing that we've seen in California is we have aging infrastructure, right? So you've had these oil and gas platforms that have been in place for decades, along with the different pipelines and other infrastructure that services that. So the older the infrastructure gets, and the less they are properly maintained, the more you see an elevated risk. And so, again, the fact that we've seen two major spills in California in the past decade, the one off Santa Barbara and then the more recent one off Southern California, shows you that the trend's not going in the right direction.
Few people understand the generational effects of oil spills, as well as Violet Sage Walker. She's a native Californian born into the Chumash tribe and serves as the chairwoman for the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. After suffering the firsthand effects of a series of oil spills over the last 50 years, her father, the late Chief Fred Collins, began the process of having their local coastline designated as a national marine sanctuary. It's the ocean equivalent to our national parks.
My name is Violet Sage Walker. I'm the chairwoman for the Northern Chumash Tribal Council, and we're the nominators for the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary that was designated last November 2024. I was born in Avila, and our family has ties to the villages all the way up and down the coast from Morro Bay all the way down to Santa Barbara and inland to Lopez Lake. And we've been living here our whole lives. I'm seventh generation beekeeper, farmer, rancher in the area. We are descendants from some of the Chumash vaqueros that rode and trained horses here on the old ranchos in California. And I still have horses. We still keep bees. We still have farms and grow food. And most of our family has been involved in protecting the coastline and ocean conservation going back multiple generations, back to the 60s when we first started experiencing this thing for the first time called an oil spill. So back in the 60s was our first experience, with a massive oil spill, and the largest one at the time in the Santa Barbara Channel. So we've rose to the occasion to defend our coast and our homeland, and still doing that and hoping, to pass on the torch to some of the younger generations too. And we've got a lot of young people getting involved because of the Chumash Sanctuary and because of climate change and because of protecting the places that are sacred to us. So we got a lot going on.
The oil spill in the 60s that you referenced, which spill was that? And then what were the direct effects to the community?
So the original Union oil spill back in '69 was the largest at the time, but it's now the third largest oil spill. It affected our community in many ways, but it was more terrible for our ocean relatives. And we consider all the animals in the ocean, the dolphins and whales and sea otters and all the fish and stuff in the sea, our relatives, and our culture is intertwined with them, inseparable with them. And so the effect that it had on our animal community and birds, it really changed our lives and impacted our people and our elders in a way that was so significant and sudden and abrupt that that we have had to change who we are to protect and defend our places now. And you'd see that after the '69 oil spill, there was also a proposed liquefied natural gas out at Point Conception, and our people had been so traumatized by the '69 oil spill that they actually occupied Point Conception back in the '70s to prevent the liquefied natural gas from destroying our sacred sites and burials and our what we call the Western Gate Humquock, which is where we believe that all people's souls journey to the next life. And so in '69, the oil spill turned our people into activists, and we became part of developing Earth Day. That was the beginning of Earth Day. that was the beginning of the Clean Water Act and the Coastal Act and all these initiatives that came out of California at the time. And I will say under both parties, under both Democrats and Republicans at the time. So you remember Reagan lived in Santa Barbara during that era, and some of these environmental policies, some of the toughest ones in the world, um, were bipartisan support because people love this place as much as we do.
A more recent spill, and one that happened directly off the coast of Surfrider's headquarters in Southern California, was the Amplify oil spill in Huntington Beach. On October 1st, 2021, a pipeline operated by Amplify Energy ruptured and released an estimated 24,696 gallons of crude oil off Huntington Beach into a slick that extended over 13 square miles.
Well, there was a rupture in a pipeline, and there was, investigations that looked into that. There was allegations it may have been damaged from a ship that was anchoring. I think the larger root cause is sort of what I was referring to before, that you have aging infrastructure that's not being properly maintained, and spills happen. They just do. And so when they do happen, it's the public and it's the communities, left sort of dealing with the consequences. I remember late that evening, our CEO, Chad Nelsen, got a call from the head of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife alerting us.
It was in my backyard. I saw it washing up on beaches in Laguna. Huntington got hammered because that was closest. But, it's very interesting. At one point, the wind blew offshore. They could see it on satellite imagery. The wind blew offshore, which is good for the coasts. And there was this giant slug of oil out offshore. And then in the currents, it started shifting down south. And then it came in San Diego. So it's hard to even keep track of like where the oil is, let alone to clean it up. And then it starts to disperse. It was kind of a PR stunt, really, but in the BP spill, which was deep water, I can't remember exactly, but maybe thousands of feet deep. They were hitting the oil with this dispersant so it would break the oil into tiny little bubbles of oil. And so, like, kind of what happens when you put you have oil in your sink and you put the Dawn, it breaks into a million, instead of being a sheen, it breaks into little balls. Exact same concept. And so, they that had the advantage of not like coming to the surface and creating an oil spill we could see, but just kind of infiltrated that oil throughout the ocean ecosystem. So impossible to clean up once it's atomized, essentially. So yeah, hard to clean up. And I think, one of the challenges with it is everyone wants to react after the spill. Oh God, what do we do? And I'm like, the only thing you can do is prevent it. Like once the spill has happened, like the impacts, we're trying to minimize the damage, but the damage has kind of been done.
By the next morning, we were hearing from members of our local chapter who are on the front lines and seeing the impacts of this. And, we had beach closures in place for about 8 days. This is a time when we have a lot of tourism and recreation, Huntington Beach, Surf City, USA. And all of a sudden, no one wants to go there because they're seeing national reports about oil on the beach. One of the things that I was really proud of was the way Surfrider volunteers responded, the public, even our state agencies. People really came together and supported a cleanup effort. One of the things that Surfrider did is we launched a smartphone app that allowed people on the beach to report oil and to actually upload it, so the time and the geographic location, and then we shared that information with the official cleanup crew because oil is toxic. They were rightly so asking members of the public who weren't trained or didn't have proper equipment not to try and clean the oil. But there was a tremendous effort from people who lived in Huntington Beach and local and state government to come together and clean up the beach and try and restore this great coastline that we have in Southern California. But It was just the latest reminder that drilling means spilling, and these decisions that are made to approve new offshore drilling, those consequences will be felt for decades.
What are methods for cleaning it up? Obviously, you want to stop this where it's spilling from in the pipeline, fix the rupture, but then the
Yep.
cleanup itself, what do they do?
Yeah, so great question. And this was one of the reasons why it was so frustrating that the company, Amplify Energy, didn't immediately report the incident. But once you have an oil spill in the ocean, the main thing you want to do is you want to contain it, right? You want to stop it from spreading around in the ocean. And you also really want to stop it from making contact with land. So during the first few hours of an oil spill, that's when you want to have ships using what are called skimmers. They're these devices that float at the surface of the water, because oil floats at the surface. And so they can sort of corral and contain the oil, and then try and remove it using various scoopers and what they call diapers that kind of absorb the oil. Now, once the oil makes contact with the beach and the coastline, that's where it gets a lot trickier. And unfortunately, that's what we had. We had oil on sensitive areas, not only the beach, where it's getting mixed up with the sand, and then you have cleanup crews that have to sort of physically collect and remove that oil, including some of the beach sand. And then, oil getting, mixed up in rocky habitats, and where you have a lot of marine invertebrates and birds feeding. And, it's a mess. So it's, there's no like simple, easy way. It's just people using proper equipment, literally physically, trying to remove the oil from the public beach.
Who's responsible for cleaning it up? And then B, who pays for it?
Yeah, so great question. So under law, the responsible party, which is Amplify Energy, is responsible for that cleanup. So very quickly, what happened is after the spill, they created what was called Unified Command, which consisted of the U.S. Coast Guard, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, some other government agencies, and Amplify Energy to sort of work on that cleanup. Now, obviously, the cleanup was led by government agencies because they have the training, but the company is responsible for those, the costs of the cleanup. The other thing the company is responsible for is an environmental restoration plan, and this is still in process, which is a little bit frustrating. But basically, what happens is after the spill, there's an assessment that's done by government agencies to assess the damage to the ocean, to marine wildlife, to public beaches, and essentially to put a cost on that, and then to develop a restoration plan that the company, Amplify Energy, will be responsible for funding. So it's called the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Process, and that is still being worked on. So, a number of years after this spill happened, we are still waiting to see that draft restoration plan. There'll be a public comment period on it. And then at some point in the future, hopefully within the next year, that restoration plan, will start. But, you see how this goes. We have an oil spill that happens, late at night. And the next morning, we've got our volunteers on the beach and we're trying to figure out how to respond. But years later, the restoration work still hasn't been done.
There is, of course, one guaranteed way to prevent these spills from happening. The newly designated Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary protects 156 miles of coastline and 4,543 square miles of ocean. It was designated in November 2024, becoming America's 17th National Marine Sanctuary and also one of the largest in the system.
National marine sanctuaries have been designated going back, I think, 50 years now. They're areas of significant biodiversity and importance to animal species. For instance, there is marine sanctuaries out in Hawaii, and there's marine sanctuaries in Florida, protecting the coral flower gardens, and Marine sanctuaries protect areas that are critically significant to biodiversity and habitat, and most of that habitat is for reproduction of species. So endangered fish, things, for instance, here at Chumash, we have one of the largest populations of the resident southern sea otter, which is highly and critically endangered. And so we have areas around the nation. There's 17 now, and they're protected from things like new oil extraction, from dumping and pollution, from any other sort of extractive or damaging activities that might take place in, for instance, like bottom trawling and things like that. So these areas, Chumash Heritage joined the list, and we became the 17th National Marine Sanctuary back November 30th. And the first designated in 30 years in the ocean.
Wow.
And also the first ever led by a tribe. And that was my dad that was the original nominator. And one of the third largest. So it would have been the largest, but we had to obviously do some compromising there at the end, because we do have 3 offshore wind leases out off the coast of Morro Bay. And that has caused some problems, and that has caused us to lose the corridor they call like the gap between Morro Bay and Cambria. And so yeah, the marine sanctuary was started back over a decade ago when NOAA, National Office of Atmospheric Administration, opened up the nominations for the first time in almost 20 years. And that day, my dad and some other people, including members of Surfrider and Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Center and other coalitions, were down at the Coastal Commission hearing opposing the seismic blasting for Diablo Canyon. And there was a group of people that had gotten together, and including fishermen who were opposing seismic blasting, which is what they were going to use to map and identify the earthquake faults around Diablo Canyon, but it's also used for mapping and exploring oil and gas. And so that coalition ended up being the coalition that supported my dad and partnered with us when we put together the nomination for Chumash Heritage. The process took 10 years. And we literally got the nomination within, within the last hours of the Biden administration. And so had we waited a month, we would not have a marine sanctuary. And so I would like to just, attest to the commitment to the past administration, to Kamala Harris, to the Biden administration, the entire network of supporters from our local electeds, Lou Carbajal, Leon and Jimmy Panetta, Senator Laird, Monique Limon, all these people stuck with us, going back to Lois Capps. I mean, she was one of the first to sign on to this. And so I just want to say there was a huge decade-long campaign, and people stuck with it. People were committed and believed in it, and we got it done literally the last month of the administration. And had anything happened, it would not be here today. So the new administration is obviously trying to cut back on marine protected areas, national monuments, national parks, NOAA staff, all that stuff. So we would have been definitely on the chopping block if we had, if I tell people that we didn't let moss grow under our feet. So we had to get this done, and we had a really tight deadline. There was a long list of people against it, and for various reasons, not what you would typically see. People were against it. Fishermen were against it, which is ironic because it actually, marine sanctuaries actually improve commercial fishing. Um, and then a lot of community members were against it because they were against federal government regulations. And so, one of the most popular things that the federal government does is operate national parks and national monuments. It's the number one most popular and most enjoyed, probably branch of the federal government is our outdoor, sacred places and wild spaces and things that we enjoy regardless of how we vote, we all enjoy. And so the opposition was in a lot of ways on principle of more federal and government oversight rather than having anything to do with the ocean.
Gotcha.
And so like I said, a lot of fishermen opposed it. And I will say a lot of younger fishermen and, next generation fishermen supported it because they know that marine sanctuaries actually improve the quality and quantity of fishing in the marine sanctuaries. And so you asked like who benefited from the opposition and, the big players obviously are, offshore oil and um, offshore oil is so widely and popular in this area that I think that offshore oil didn't really cause us to delay the in the nomination of the sanctuary because we have a pretty strong. California really does not want the coastline developed, and I think the majority of people want to see the coastline protected and the offshore oil rigs decommissioned.
In January of 2025, the Biden administration issued 2 presidential memoranda banning new offshore oil and gas leases that protected 625 million acres of ocean. Considering all the repeals with the Trump administration, I was curious if those bans were still in effect.
Yes, but it's very tentative. It's worth a quick backstory because that was a huge, huge win. So, you know, if you're my age in your 50s, you remember the Exxon Valdez oil spill. It made national news. It was in 1989. And like the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill, which I wasn't around for, it was a wake-up call. And so between 1990 and 2008, for 18 years, there was a national moratorium on offshore drilling. So after Exxon Valdez, we're like, this is bad news. We're not going to drill off our coasts anymore. So everything that was out there was legacy. And that was renewed every year by Republicans and Democratic presidents and Congresses. And I actually thought this issue was behind us. Like we learned our lesson, solved the problem. We have a moratorium that everybody's supporting. Well, 2008 was the summer of drill baby drill. Oil prices got high, and George W. Bush and Congress got rid of those moratoriums. So since 2008, for the last 17 years, we've been fighting offshore drilling perpetually. The Obama administration wanted to open off drilling off the East Coast, off Virginia, and that was scuttled when the Deepwater Horizon spill happened. So, there was efforts for that 18-year period to open our coast. We've been in a 18-year battle to fight drilling off all coasts of the United States. So when Biden uh, protected all of those areas to drilling, which he did in January of this year, we were thrilled. That was kind of the culmination of an 18-year talk about going from reactive to proactive, right? For 18 years, we were reactively fighting proposals from both sides of the aisle all the time, uh, with some success. Nothing new really got opened. A couple more, some stuff in the Gulf, um, which is still active, the eastern or the western Gulf of Mexico, but or Gulf of America, some would say. Um, and so that was a huge win, right? We need to keep this stuff in the ground for a bunch of reasons. It's bad for our coastal economies. It's bad for the planet. Burning this oil is going to continue to heat up the planet, kill our coral reefs, and create sea level rise if you're looking at it from a surfer's perspective. Uh, Trump, on his first day of office, signed an executive order trying to undo the Biden protections. We believe that's illegal. There's something called the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act that dictates who and how can approve offshore drilling in federal waters. And we think it takes an act of Congress to change that, not the president. So we sued him over that, and that litigation's ongoing. So that's one threat to those protections. And right now, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is in the Department of Interior, is going through a standard process called the 5-year leasing process to open up areas of the coast to drilling. So they're presuming that executive order will work and that we're going to be back to where we were, and they can like use this process, which is the process we've been fighting for decades, to open new areas of the coast to drilling. So there's a executive order, there's a lawsuit against the executive order, and then there's kind of like the more like bureaucratic process to open up new leases, and we're fighting that too.
What many people don't know is the oil and gas industry is sitting on thousands of unused leases in the Gulf of Mexico. So essentially stockpiling, more leases for future development. And once you have an oil and gas lease sale that is sold through an offshore drilling auction, that lease is going to be in place sort of indefinitely till that resource is exhausted. So it's not just an impact of a couple years. We're talking 30 or 40 years or more. So, the spills that we've had in Southern California in the past decade, that goes back to oil and gas lease sales that were approved in the 1970s and early 1980s. So it really shows the generational impact of decisions that could get made this year or next year in terms of things that our children are going to be dealing with in the future.
There are a lot of modern energy sources that could replace civilization's dependence on oil, but one environmental non-negotiable is that the upgrade needs to be to a renewable source of energy.
If you think about the trajectory of like communications from the telegraph to the iPhone and like the incredible innovation and change that we have. I mean, it's simply incredible what we can do today. And then you look at the history of like energy production, and like we went from like burning wood to peat to whale oil to coal to petroleum. Like we're still like fundamentally like burning things.
Mm.
And meanwhile, and they're all these limited resources, like we will run out of them eventually by definition. Like how long we can debate, but like they're non-renewable resources. And then we have these renewable resources like geothermal, solar, and wind. And so if we invested the same way we invested in technology in power, we would have like infinitely abundant, cheap power. So I think the answer is yes. The oil and gas industry, who has obviously a vested interest, has done a good job in convincing us all that like we're dependent on it, and those alternative sources have a million problems. Be like the people at GE or AT&T, be like the people at AT&T saying, no, you can't cut the cord on your phone. It'll be unreliable. You think that we can actually communicate through space? No way. So I feel like the oil and gas industry is selling us that same thing, is that future technology. It's funny because I think as a society, we're so optimistic about the future of technology, AI, and everything else. And when it comes to power, we're all of a sudden a bunch of scaredy cats about the future and like to make a million reasons why it won't work. Not only is a future without oil and gas possible, it'll be a better future. We'll have clean air, we'll have infinite energy, it'll be cheaper, and the current hurdles that we have are all solvable.
Who, for lack of a better term, do you see preventing this investment in all renewable sources of energy?
Well, right now, Congress is making a number of decisions that are prioritizing and even subsidizing new oil and gas development and discouraging a lot of the incentives that were in place put into place recently by Congress to actually accelerate the transition to renewable energy. So this is something I think all of us should be really frustrated around. I think we have a great opportunity in this country to invest and to become a world leader in clean energy solutions. And this applies to almost every aspect of either, environmental protection or natural resource management, right? Is when you're protecting public resources, those public resources provide benefits to all of us, right? But if you're talking about a trade-off between, okay, well, we're going to make the air a little bit dirtier for every single person who breathes the air, but those costs are diffused, versus a single company or a single industry that stands to benefit. Our government's decision-making process is kind of designed, unfortunately, to reward the squeaky wheel who's going to, talk about their singular interests. And so, one of the reasons that groups like Surfrider exist is to help raise public awareness and to help give people the tools and sort of the support to engage in decisions that affect public resources. Because that's part of our role. We're a grassroots organization, and we think that government should be accessible. We think that people who serve in elected positions to make decisions, they should be responsive to the communities that they're representing. And obviously, people are busy, and they may not have time to go to every single city council meeting or go to DC to meet with their member of Congress. But that doesn't mean that their voice or their perspective should not be accounted for in decisions.
Yeah, I mean, join the Surfrider Foundation so we can say that we have X number of members opposed to this. You can contact your congressman, and we've got action alerts on our website that would help you do that at surfrider.org. There'll be a series of public hearings this fall, so we'll be rallying people to actually attend those hearings. So if there's a hearing in your area, you can do that. And if you what we do at Surfrider is, if you follow along, we're going to be providing you. This is probably going to be an 18-month fight. So we'll be providing opportunities to call, to make input, to write letters, to reach out to your representatives. Your business can sign on and say, if you're a coastal business, you can sign on to one of our petitions and say, hey, as a coastal business, this is bad for my future as a business, local business. Lots of ways people can get involved, and I think this is gonna play out through the rest of 2025 and probably into 2026.
Surfrider's goal is to end all new offshore oil drilling leases across U.S. waters. And our grassroots advocacy has been a driving force behind every major win against offshore drilling over the last decade. We are currently advocating to Congress and the executive branch to restore protections, as well as launching strategic legal actions to restore those protections. And this is all in addition to grassroots conversations through our communities and businesses with locally elected officials. The strength of this movement relies entirely on you and I. It's a nationwide community of ocean advocates, and together we must constantly remind Congress that it is essential to protect the ocean, not fossil fuel companies. So join me in becoming a member of Surfrider, because the ocean needs more friends now more than ever at surfrider.org. My name is David Scales for the Surfrider podcast, brought to you by the Surfrider Foundation. And until next time, learn more at surfrider.org.